Overdose deaths in Quebec. They're rising sharply, with 2024 marking the province's deadliest year yet, 645 lives lost. Now, experts warning the crisis could worsen without urgent change, pointing to BC and Alberta as examples of how overdose trends don't decline quickly. Highly potent drugs like fentanyl and carfentanil are increasingly present, and many users aren't even aware they're taking opioids. Despite growing alarm, critics say government response remains slow and inadequate. Let's go now to Sarah Larney, an associate professor at Université de Montréal. Sarah, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So just how bad is it?
So what we know is that we are probably very much at the beginning of this upswing in overdose deaths in the province. So we've seen a year-on-year increase of 30% to 2024, which is quite shocking. But then also, as you say, if we compare to BC and Alberta, we can see that there's still plenty of room for this to get much worse.
Why can't we stop it? Why does it seem like it's inevitable? When we've seen this movie before in other provinces, hopefully we can learn from the other provinces and turn it around. Why does it seem impossible?
So one of the difficulties is that effective interventions to prevent overdose are kind of unpopular with politicians and also often with communities. And it is a real struggle. So we know that, for example, supervised injecting facilities are an incredibly important way of saving lives in this kind of situation. But they are difficult to find places to put them that people will not be upset about. People do often think that these are things that are just enabling drug use rather than seeing it as an opportunity to help a person to survive until they're well enough to actually make the changes that will help them not be at risk of overdose.
So this is where, for me, the subject gets murky, right? Because I've talked to people that live near these supervised sites, okay? Mm-hmm. Whether it's in St. Henry or it's people downtown. In downtown, the streets near one of the sites has been called Crack Alley. Mm-hmm. You have the stories from people that live in the condos there that now they don't feel safe walking down even in their own condos down staircases, right? And I've talked to people in St. Henry and they've got kids and they are fearful when they walk through parks now and that kind of thing. So I guess the real question I have, and it's a genuine question, you have to believe me, it comes from a good place. Mm-hmm. Every time I see these safe injection sites or supervised consumption sites, it seems like things get worse. It doesn't seem like they get better.
So a couple of things. One thing I will say is that sites go into places where people are already injecting in public. So removing a site doesn't make that problem go away. And we know that these sites don't necessarily really attract people either. That the honeypot effect has pretty much been disproven because, as I say, the sites are already going to places where people are, but also people who inject are not taking the time to go somewhere else to inject. Like, they're going to get their drugs and then use pretty quickly. So the sites exist in places where people are already injecting in public, and they provide an opportunity to try and move that inside. Now, what can happen, though, is if the sites are not properly funded and given the support that they need to do their job, then you can get these difficulties, like you say, of people congregating and people feeling unsafe. And so what this really comes down to for me is about making sure that services are adequately resourced to actually do the job that they've been tasked with. Because if we say we set up a supervised injecting facility, but then we tell people, but also we're not going to give you enough money or enough staff to actually run the place, then you're really setting people up for failure and to actually cause more problems.
Didn't they try that in BC, though? I mean, that's the thing. Like, BC, they seem to have, put a tremendous amount of resources and funding, and even more places. It seems like they've gone down that path where they're not going to make money the issue here, and it hasn't solved the problem there.
Yeah, because there's also the issue of simply the drug supply. So the drugs that are on the street now are stronger than ever before. They're contaminated with a range of substances that are often unknown at the time. People don't know that they're necessarily buying these things. And we can do things like offer drug checking services. But even then, we have to know what we're checking for. And so when you've got this very toxic drug supply, people are very much at risk. And so it does seem, in a sense, that we can't really intervene our way out of a problem. And so what that then suggests is we also need a variety of other interventions, so things like naloxone, also supports to access better drug treatment and things like that. But then also looking at the broader social factors. So I don't think it's a coincidence that housing prices have increased at the same time as overdose mortality has increased in Quebec. This is very much an indicator of a broader social issue around poverty and income equality and how we actually support people who are the most vulnerable in our society.
Is there any place, let's keep it to our continent here. It's a big continent, but Canada, the U.S., is there any place that is turning it around where you can say, hey, this is where you point, see what they're doing? It's working.
Gosh, I wish I could say that there is. There's definitely been a lot of attempts at trying new things. So we know that things like efforts to work on decriminalisation. Unfortunately, though, there's been real issues in the way that those things have been rolled out, which has also damaged then further efforts to try and implement these different ways of doing things. We could also look more broadly at places like Portugal, which has decriminalised drugs and had great success there in reducing not only overdose but also HIV infection. There are definitely alternative models to how we can manage drugs and the drug problem. Unfortunately, the great difficulty is political will and just really making sure that we do a good job of actually implementing a model that has every chance of success.
With Sarah Larney here, wrapping up with Sarah, an associate professor at Université de Montréal. We're talking about Quebec's overdose crisis. So, Sarah, listen, I've heard from people that say the issue is that we're not being tough enough. And I'll say this, it was a couple years back, I moved. I lived downtown, and we had a kid coming. We had our first baby coming. And there were people using drugs on the street, where we were near, in between the old port and the village. Mm-hmm. And there were people using drugs on the street. We'd be walking or trying to go through a park and that kind of thing and said, okay, we got to move, right? And, part of me wished that there was a tougher stance on public drug use and using drugs on the street. Why doesn't that work?
The one thing we know is that if you are kind of tougher on drugs, I guess, is all you're doing is pushing a problem into the shadows, more into the shadows and more into the margins, and that actually just makes more problems. It makes it less likely that a person will try and get help because they are more concerned about being arrested. It makes it less likely that people will call an ambulance in the event that there is an overdose. It also just increases things like shame and stigma, and we know that stigma in particular is actually a big part of this problem because it prevents people from speaking up and saying, look, I have a problem, I would like to get some help. People become ashamed, people become scared. Ending up in jail is not a place that's actually going to help people to address the problems that have led them to where they are.
Does it seem to you we're watching a movie we've already seen and that what we've seen in BC is going to come to Quebec? It's just a matter of time? I really hope not, but I also am not particularly optimistic in that regard. The drugs supply is it's unregulated. It is very unpredictable because of the way our system currently works. And so the people who are producing drugs and trafficking drugs do what they do to make the most money, and the way you make the most money is to make more potent products. And so that's really how we've ended up with the situation, for example, in Western Canada. And so I fear that is probably the direction of things in Quebec, and I hope that we're able to make available more interventions and better responses and planning for that. We'll leave it there on that note. Sarah, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you.
That's Sarah Larney, an associate professor at Université de Montréal.